그때 그들이 15년이라고 말해줬다면 조금이라도 견디기가 쉬워졌을까? 아니었을까?
I'd like to pose a question. At what point does influence become imitation?
내 맘입니다, 이 씨발놈들아.
I'd suggest that the aim of all art forms is to constantly evolve so that every medium develops new methods of expression, thus harnessing the ability to create new forms of insight. A select number of creatives have been held in reverence over the years as their artistry offered something culturally relevant. However, now we may look at their works and find that through adaptation and alteration, we can offer something new. So how do you adapt from one medium to another? If you want to create something based on existing material, how do you A. distinguish it enough so that it maintains its own identity, and B. preserve the intentions of the original material? Well, let's examine a film that did just that. Released in 2003, Oldboy was an interpretation of the story of Oedipus, but more importantly, it employed the storytelling method from the source's period. First, let's discuss an often unacknowledged component of filmmaking, the purpose of adaptation. When modifying someone's work to a new medium, that art form should capitalise on the elements exclusive to that form. So in this instance, adaptation from ancient theatre to film can't rely on mimicry, it has to take features that don't translate and find a way to make them work. So let's look at Oldboy as an example of adapting existing material, as well as the unique format of tragedian storytelling.
누나하고 난 다 알면서도 사랑했어요. 너희도 그럴 수 있을까?
The Greek tragedy was a very specific method of storytelling, as certain elements were almost a requirement in order to be classified as such, and nowhere has this been more validated than Aristotle's writings on dramatic theory, Poetics. In these writings, Aristotle hypothesized the ingredients that create a successful tragedy. A quick summarization is that tragedy is drama, not narrative, meaning that it's the actions that are the driving force, to show not to tell. Aristotle claimed tragedy to be higher and more philosophical than history. History simply related something that had already happened and dealt with particulars, details that may be time or culturally specific and therefore irrelevant to the masses. Whereas tragedy shows us what's possible according to the law of probability or necessity. Tragedy dramatises what may happen and uses universal themes to its effect. Aristotle proposed 6 principles of tragedy in order of importance, and the manner in which they should be treated in order to achieve effective drama. The first and most important principle is plot. Aristotle defined plot as the actual events presented to an audience. The key component for tragic plot was that the structure should heavily focus on cause and effect. Ancient Greece was a time very focused on the nature of causality, a post-hoc era that attempted to uncover the reasoning behind every action without inadvertently creating a fallacy. The roots of this belief came from the notion that every individual's life was prescribed to them by the gods, and that a person was incapable of escaping their destiny. This line of thinking became salient in their stories, with Aristotle defining tragedy as the imitation of action and life, as the structure followed what was believed at the time to be the fundamental order of the universe, a chain of events. And it's this philosophy that shaped their storytelling. The proposal was a unity of action in tragedy, with every event causing the following event. This technique can be visualised by Freytag's triangle. So let's see how Oldboy utilises this. Well, typically Greek tragedies open with a prologue, which would often be a monologue explaining the topic or themes of the play. However, Oldboy provides cinematic flair to its structure through its editing, a unique characteristic of the visual arts. Taking advantage of a technique exclusive to the form is the kind of thing you want to see in adaptation. Here, it offers us a different take on plot that theatre couldn't offer, a redesign of chronology. Maintaining its cause and effect core, flashbacks take us to the past, and the prologue is a precursor to the story, but not the events themselves. By showing us events that will come to pass, the film develops that inevitability of fate, and the irreversible nature of time that was intrinsic to ancient Greek culture. What was a factor due to societal tradition is now a factor because of filmic techniques. But let's get back to that triangle. The first event to kickstart the chain is called the incentive moment. In Oldboy, this would be the capturing of Odesu. But as the structure stems from a philosophy of causation, there must be a cause for this moment. Yet in tragedies, the incentive's causes are to be downplayed, whereas its effects are stressed. So we don't know why Odesu is kidnapped, but it's the effects of the event that stand out to us. This becomes very important later. From the incentive moment onwards, every event must cause the next. This chain leading up to the climax is called the complication, or desis, and is used to raise questions about the story, because something is linking these moments. Perhaps it was that initial downplayed cause. Aristotle said that the worst tragedies had episodic plots, when the only thing that tied two events together is that they simply occur to the same person. But if you want to create a true tragedy, there can exist no such thing as coincidence. Aristotle stressed the importance of complex plot in tragedy, and this meant that it needed two essential requirements, a peripecia and an anagnoresis. In order to attain true tragedy, this structure is integral. The anagnoresis is what we would refer to as the climax, and the peripecia is the event that precedes the climax and simultaneously causes it. The peripecia is represented by a character producing an effect opposite from what they intended. Aristotle referred to this error as a reversal of intention. Here it would be Odesu arriving at the penthouse to finally seek his revenge. Following this moment is our anagnoresis, or climax, which for tragedy is described as the change from ignorance to knowledge. The moment Odesu discovers the horrific truth about his daughter is displayed as a revelation to the character. The anagnoresis cause and effects must be stressed. We finally realise why all this has happened and what this will do to our character. But to achieve the most out of this point, we need to look back at the incentive moment.
당신이 그날 일을 기억 못하는 진짜 이유가 뭔 줄 알아? 그건 말이야. 그냥 잊어버린 거야.
As we said, the incentive moment has a cause, it's simply less acknowledged than its effects. So when we look at the triangle, we realise that the true starting point of our story lies outside of the movie's contained world. This is my personal take on Freytag's triangle. By planning for a cause for the incentive, we see that the triangle is not just a representation of importance over time, but a demonstration of narrative relationship. Freytag's triangle shows that the resolution is linked to the incentive, with the conclusion of tragedy traditionally offering some closure, knowing that the cause for this series of unfortunate events has been resolved. However, when we visualise the grander picture, we see that beyond the confined spaces of the film's world, nothing has been resolved, as closure was only brought to the incentive moment onwards. Odesu knows why he was kidnapped, but that still doesn't remove the events that happened. The genesis, I believe, is the heart of real tragedy, as the chain may be broken, but the laws of causation tell us that the origin can never be undone, so ultimately, neither can its effects. Knowingly disregarding this initial cause until a specific moment is how a twist should be approached, and it's what makes Oldboy's climax all the more effective. This leads to the character's downfall, known as the catastrophe, followed by the final scene of suffering. In Greek theatre, this scene required a testament of true injustice, to see the antagonist utterly destroy the character through sheer excessive pride, otherwise known as hubris. As Odesu thinks he can finally exact his revenge, he gets one more gruesome reminder of his actions. Hubris is a moment not to glamorise the antagonist, but to simply further harm the protagonist. The climax to resolution is the lucis, to answer all of those questions raised during the complication, and it's the finale wherein the causes must be stressed and the effects must be downplayed. How we got here is clear, but where we're going is uncertain.
사랑해요, 아저씨.
Aristotle placed character after plot in terms of importance, as with tragedy it seems to be the plot that shapes the emotional state of the story. Character determines men's qualities, but their actions determine whether they're happy or not. With tragedy, character emerges as a reactionary impulse of circumstance. However, Aristotle did include some qualities that were necessary traits of a tragic character. The first quality was simply that the character must be good, to ensure that their change in fortune is effective. The cause of the anagnoresis cannot take place for a tragic hero due to a vice of that character, merely a vulnerability. In Odesu's case, this would be the frailty of knowledge. Seeking out the truth was the reasoning for his punishment. The term for this coined by Aristotle was the hamartia, a tragic irony. Extreme severity for a minor wrongdoing is what evokes that sense of despair we feel when watching tragedy. Aristotle created a list of attributes that should be found in tragic characters, such as consistency and motivation, and to be realistic. However, the one that I think is the most interesting was the fifth and final quality that Aristotle proposed: to be true to life, and yet more beautiful. What Aristotle meant with this is that the character must be in some way idealised. Many Greek tales involve the gods in some manner, and many of these stories pertain to gods gaining human attributes. Thus, to fall from the platform of deity to mortal is a tragedy in itself. However, I believe that it's just as tragic to reach a godlike level only to have it all stripped away. This is the situation of Odesu. He begins as a relatively benign person, as we watch him transform into an unstoppable force, until ultimately, a la the pattern of tragic irony, the thing that moulded him this way becomes the thing that destroys him. A rule of thumb for tragedy is to display a fall from grace. Odesu has almost accelerated his evolutionary state to become something beyond pure flesh and blood. He becomes the very incarnation of vengeance. This grants him that quality of idealisation, yet a balance is reached because we still see the glimpses of empathy within the character to remind us that he's a good man.
아니, 그 새끼 잡아 죽인 다음에.
Thought being Aristotle's third principle was essentially the ruling that actions should speak for themselves without verbal exposition. Basically, to avoid any speech that the character wouldn't express. This perhaps is more important in theatre, however Oldboy demonstrates this in its most important scene. I'd argue that the greatest twist should be shown and understood by an audience, because being told is an explanation, but being shown is a revelation. And this brings us back to adaptation to different mediums, because some of the principles of theatre become irrelevant through comparison, but not all of them. Principle number 5 was focused on the chorus, which in theatre was a choir used for explaining what was occurring in the story, or to fill in the gaps in the story that were unable to be performed. However, Oldboy utilises a voiceover, which can be seen as the cinematic version of a tragedian chorus. We gain knowledge of character reactions without them explicitly blurting out their emotions, and it also works as a transitional device, just as the chorus did. Oldboy combines the third and fifth principles of tragic theory to create something uniquely cinematic.
맞아요?
아직 쉽지도 않았다.
Adaptation isn't easy, but the most important thing to remember is to make use of what that medium is best at. The writings on expression emphasise the use of metaphors to enhance the themes on the story. Now we see this in Oldboy's art design, whether it be the theme of inevitability through time, or reflections of our character through the James Ensor painting. But art design isn't an instance isolated to film, whereas others are. The superimposing of Odesu and Li Wu Jin to show that their intentions are one and the same is displayed through a technique that can only be done visually. These moments are the purpose of adaptation. What can you show that other mediums can't? And what can we learn from Greek tragedy? It's a way to tell a story that directly looks at human suffering, to deal with injustice and sorrow through well thought out elements that serve to exacerbate those intense emotions. The final thing to mention about Greek tragedy is that the link between the art and the viewer was catharsis. Witnessing what was possible to us meant that those emotions of pity and fear that we experience become purified. Spectacle being the final principle meant that the story had to be improbable, but not impossible. We have to witness heinous acts, because this is the natural order of the universe, and someone, somewhere, is going to be that tragic hero. An ancient saying about tragic characters was that they should never gaze upon the sun again. And as the credits for Oldboy roll, our main characters watch what may be their final sunset. Tragedy means you are destined to a life of sorrow, but as Oldboy taught us, laugh and the world laughs with you. Weep and you weep alone.